I wanted to once again welcome everybody to our roundtable today. The topic is racial trauma and mental health implications. And this is a series, and this is part one of the series, Shifting from Resilience to Liberation. Racism and race-based stress are prevalent throughout so many aspects of life, yet their impact does not sufficiently get recognized as a form of trauma. This pervasive form of trauma, known as racial trauma, involves persistent acts of racial bias, microaggressions, discriminations, intolerance, and/or hate crimes over an extended period of time. Today, we have with us Judith Sadora and Tracy Hopkins. Judith Sadora is the founder and consultant of Triune Health and Wellness. Her work is centered from the understanding that trauma exists and impacts who we are as individuals and communities. As a systems therapist, she takes a perspective and worldview that acknowledges that we are part of communities that are centered around relational dynamics. Judith is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Oregon and Nevada and holds a master's in marriage and family therapy and is in the process of completing her doctoral program for marriage and family therapy. Tracy Hopkins is Business Development Director and Inclusion and Belonging Specialist at outBACK Therapeutic Expeditions. Tracy has worked in behavioral and mental health for over 20 years and serves as the Business Development Director and Inclusion and Belonging Specialist at outBACK Therapeutic Expeditions. She received her master's in social work and is a certified professional diversity coach. Her experiences, coupled with the extensive and expansive leadership roles held within both the therapeutic and educational realms, has served as catalysts in awakening her inner story chaser. By chasing the stories, she believes that our awe-inspiring connections are created, a deeper personal investment to move through the world as a collective is ignited, and the permission to chase our own stories are actualized. Just some light housekeeping items before we officially get started. This will be a roughly 35-minute presentation followed by Q&A. You will receive a recording after the presentation. And please note that this is being recorded. And it will be on our YouTube channel. If you don't want your image to appear in the recording, you're welcome to turn off your camera, although we do love to see your face and welcome questions and dialogue at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I am going to turn the presentation over to Tracy and Judith.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. I love all the hands waving and facial expressions. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I love the energy. It's almost like you're in the room with us. Before we get going, we just definitely thank you so much, Amanda, for the introductions. We're going to take just a little bit of time to share with you maybe a little bit more about us that you might not know just by looking at us. And we're going to explain to you what the flow will be like with us today, and then also present some invitations before we get going. Judith and I were talking earlier, and as the folks from the dorm clearly understand, as well as you all, we are going to barely scratch the surface today, hence this being a series. So we're going to try to pack a bunch of things in, and we're going to ask y'all to hopefully drop from your intellectual selves into your heart space and into your soulful selves over the next hour with us. So for me, I identify as being biracial and multicultural. I am a daughter of an immigrant and a proud mama to a multiracial 13-year-old boy. You know, think of me over the years as I go through these teenage years. I also am the founder of a coaching and consulting practice called Dare to Rise, where we invite people to engage through pivotal conversations, awaken your inner story chaser, and what I call go through a revolutionary transformation process in figuring out who you are and the versions of yourself that you want to show up everywhere. So that's a little bit more about me, and then I'm going to hand it over to Judith.
Thank you. Yes, I'm so excited to be here. A little bit about me. I identify myself as Afro-Haitian American. Very much Nigerian to the soul and to the heart. I know it because every time Nigerian music comes on, my spirit just does something and my body just moves a certain way that I'm like, oh yeah, that's my motherland. That's where I'm from. I am also a daughter to an immigrant. And I do not have any children's, but I have a Buffy that is a dog that is my child, and acts like my child. And so I am a mother in that way. So as you heard before, I have a practice here in Central Oregon, Triune Health and Wellness. I probably would best identify myself as an integrative psychotherapist, but really like a liberation focused healer, co-healer is probably what I would identify myself as. I have the blessing and the pleasure and the honor of being a part of a collective of BIPOC, Black, Brown, Indigenous, clinicians and healers here in the community of Central Oregon. We have a little hub and we gather together and we talk about the very things that we're going to be talking about today. And we have created space to be able to offer healing practices to the community here that look like us pretty much, and have seen firsthand the effects and the benefits of what it looks like to actually meet people where they're at, and being very aware of racial trauma and how it impacts the body, the mind, and the spirit. So that is just a little bit about me. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah. Some of you, I recognize the names that popped up in here, may have been at a presentation or a workshop that both Judith and I facilitated before. And so the next set of expectations that I go over with you won't be foreign. And for most of the folks who are here joining us for the first time, we find it very important for us to acknowledge and name the fact that we are not experts. As a matter of fact, I don't believe that there are any experts in this space. And so what we're really here to do is figure out how to move towards a deeper understanding, and how to best do that as a collective. Our hope really here, whenever we have these discussions, is really to plant seeds of curiosity. And encourage people to really take notice of what comes up for you throughout the conversations, and start chasing the whys behind it, why it came to believe that you might be holding on to certain belief systems that you're holding on to. The other piece of expectations that we like to put out there is that in addition to no experts really being in the room, we often find that there are so many people who came before us that have put out really great content and information. And there are those who will be coming after us who will do the same. And so the way in which Judith and I like to flow is to utilize short video clips that provide some sort of informative piece on what we're going to be talking about. And we use that as a launching point to engage in dialogue with one another. So those are just the expectations that we wanted to connect with you about. One thing too, before we go into our invitations, would be when we get to a point of actually starting the video clips and the dialogue, what we'll ask all of you as participants to do is, if you're on your computer, well, most of you are on the computer. For those of you on the computer, if you look on your bottom left corner of the Zoom, you'll see your video icon and a little arrow that comes up. And so what we'll ask is, first turn your videos off. And then when you hit that arrow, you will go to video settings. And then under video settings, you will go down and make sure that you click on the box that says hide non-video participants. You can actually do it now if it moves you to do so. But ultimately what that will do is, once Judith and I start this presentation, she and I will be the only ones on the screen. We do that for two reasons. One is that we're hoping to invite everyone to engage fully and listen to what's coming from your screen and not be distracted by the beautiful faces that are on the screen. And then in true transparency, it really helps my anxiety and my nerves, knowing that I'm just looking at Judith as we're having this conversation. So that's all about expectations. Thank you. I do love the feedback though. Thank you so much.
So we're gonna go right into the invitations. And so given the topics and what we're gonna be discussing and sharing about, it has the ability to really stir up and evoke and bound a lot of different emotions and feelings. And we want to create space to be able to honor and hold those feelings and emotions that come up for us as we're talking about sensitive topics, right? And starting to normalize topics, because that's the reason why we're doing it, is to normalize the conversation and dig a little bit deeper. And so the whole point of what we're doing is to really increase this sense of, it's like raising critical consciousness, allowing us to think deeper about things, think a little bit more critically about the things in which that we believe and how we act and how we see things, and also being able to hold that space for the emotions. And so I really encourage and invite all of you to jot down what feelings come up. What do you notice? There may very well be things that you do not even agree with that's being said today when we talk and we discuss. Take notice of that. Jot those down, and then invite yourself to be able to ponder and raise some critical consciousness around why is that, what is coming up, and why is it. And so, and you can use that time to be able to talk with friends, talk to groups of people maybe that were here, or talk to people in your life to ponder more about that. But the idea is to really honor and take notice of what comes up while we're having these discussions and this conversation. And so that's the invitation that I have for you. And also noticing what comes up in your body. When we're talking about things like this, I know for me, Tracy and I know we can sit here and we have conversations and we notice that we get triggered or we feel some type of way, or it's a memory or a reminder of things, hence trauma. And so being able to take a breath, being able to breathe through, if you have to close your eyes, if you need to stand up, if you need to walk around. The good thing about being on video is that you have the ability and the openness to do that. So I also invite you to move your body or do what you need in order to allow some of the feelings and emotions to pass through, maintain presence and to stay present in the conversation. But that's it.
Great. Okay, so before we begin, if you haven't already done so, we will encourage everyone to go ahead and turn your cameras off. And like I said, that little arrow next to stop video, if you go under video settings and just click on that piece that says hide non-video participants, you should only see the two of us at this point. So again, we're just going to launch into it, but I just lied because we're not going to launch into it just quite yet. I want to talk about the importance of why we take the time to do what we just did. Tell a little bit about our identifiers that you might not, that's not easily recognizable, and also talking about the expectations and the invitations, and it really has to do with the topics that we have a tendency to cover. It's a lot, and so it invokes a lot of emotion, in my humble opinion. And so before we just kind of get into it all, we want to make sure that we set the tone in a way that we're able to move forward, right, together. So without further ado, we're going to show a really short clip, and then we'll get going.
Do you identify as Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, or a person of color? Have you ever had reactions to dangerous events that are real or perceived experiences with racial discrimination? How about witnessing or hearing about racial discrimination or harm towards Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latino, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, and people of color? These experiences could be traumatic experiences, specifically a form of race-based stress called racial trauma. These racial traumatic experiences may include threats of harm and injury, humiliating and shaming events. These responses can be related to other challenges, such as post-traumatic stress. However, racial trauma is unique because it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries due to exposure and re-exposure to race-based stress. Racial trauma impacts communities of color both physically and psychologically, including hypervigilance, nightmares, symptoms of anxiety and depression, irritability, sleep disturbance, avoidance, and somatic expressions like headaches and heart palpitations. For more information about trauma and how to respond, head to bgca.net.
I really appreciate the fact that it's like a minute and 55 seconds, and they do a really great job of telling us not just what racial trauma, the definition of. I love the reflection on just what trauma is. And here's what it made me wonder about. I've been working in the world of mental health care for almost 2 decades now. And the idea of trauma, the definition of trauma, the experiences of trauma, the legitimacy of what that is and what people experience isn't something, for the most part, in our line of work that gets a lot of pushback. And I don't know about you, but what came up for me is, so why is it that when we add the word racial trauma, that up until, for me anyway, up until the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, it didn't gain the sense of notoriety. And so I'm just curious about, your thoughts on why that might be.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, I remember, Tracy, that in the start of me in my career, right, my mental just education and things like that, I think it was at postgraduate school, and really diving more into like trauma-based type of work, understanding PTSD and all that kind of stuff. I remember always thinking to myself, that very thing, like, how come, I'm like, centuries of violence and harm perpetuated, not only that, but like, there was legal systems, right? There was laws, there was policies and legal systems set in place to support and justify the violence on Black bodies for centuries, and realizing, okay, so what happened with that? Like, trauma is real based off of the understanding of trauma and how it impacts the body, and how there's generational trauma that is passed down from generation to generation. Then what's with my people? Right. I remember looking at my family system and being like, oh my God, I can see the perpetuating problems of trauma and the impacts of that even passed down. But there was no conversation about that. My grad school didn't talk about that. My program didn't talk about it. There was no trainings. When you go and you attend trauma trainings, I just never heard it until I came across Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote the book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And I remember when I read that book and I started watching her YouTubes and diving in, I was like, yes, this is what I'm talking about. The impacts of slavery and how it shows up in Black communities today. And so it's like, finally, someone that's talking about it, but it's not mainstream. Why is that, right? In Western psychology and mental health, When I mentioned her name, nobody knew about it. I'm like, interesting. I understand why that is. But nonetheless, seeing that issue and that problem. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. That was something that really was confusing to me. And even as I watched, I would watch police brutality, when you're watching every clip of a Black man who is murdered, right, in a situation, every time that I watched that interaction, I saw trauma. I saw the bodily response of trauma, but nobody was ever talking about it. And so, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think about the fact that like at the end of the day, the definition of what is traumatic was identified and formalized through the lens of people who don't look like us, right? And then going back to what you said earlier is that the violence and the traumatic experiences that have been placed upon Black and brown bodies has been happening since the beginning of this nation. And has continued to evolve in the ways in which the acts of trauma have been implicated, and yet they're still there. And so I also think about, I think of this phrase of how it's deeply woven into our system. And so the reason why, I think one of the reasons, the factors that play into why racial trauma may not be seen as, for lack of a better terminology, real trauma, has a lot to do with over time, because the evolution of racism and dominant culture, those who hold positions of power are really smart at branding and rebranding. And I think that the way people define racism, it has always existed, it's just evolved. Yet over time, I think people are not understanding that it's evolution. And so you think of racism being that old school, very overt way of cross burnings, KKK, that kind of scenario, as opposed to the covert ways in which it continues to infiltrate institutions like our education system, healthcare system, criminal justice system. And so those of us who fall within the margins and at the intersections, those of us who are Black and brown, are experiencing the continued impacts of traumatic experiences, yet those who do not understand and do not experience what we experience, because they don't see it, they don't understand it, I think that it can be quickly be dismissed as, well, that just doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. I think there's something so true to that, because when anything that is covert also is easily dismissed. I think the other term of it is like, if it's covert, I can gaslight the crap out of that.
Yes.
I can make you feel like you're kind of crazy and that's not really happening.
Right.
And that's another form, if we understand abusive relationships, whether there's manipulation or stuff that's happening, right? We can understand the impact of naming something, experiencing something, but because it is done in subtle ways, it's not believed, and what that does to an individual, what that does to their mental health, what that does to their autonomy, to their boundaries and such. And so that is so true. There are many, at least the Black and brown folks I work with, I constantly see this repetitive theme of them not being able to really set boundaries, trust themselves, second guessing themselves, wondering if something is true and something is real. But part of that is because of these covert ways that can easily be dismissed by what we see as the dominant culture within American society. And so, and that impacts our mental health as individuals and as Black and brown people, right? But then we know what's true. It may not be overt, but we understand the language, we understand the red tape, we understand the resistance, we understand everything around that, because we have learned to understand that. I remember, I'll say this real quick, I remember there was a panel discussion that I did here in town, and there was someone in the audience, it was I believe, First Nations, Indigenous individual, and I remembered he said, we have had to learn more about white folks. We know more about you than you know about yourself or you know about us, because we've had to. And so when you are in a situation where there is violence or stuff or oppression, or whether it's covert or overt racism or whatever it may be, you have to be very resilient, and you have to be very, like, it's like survival. So what do I need to do in order to survive in this situation? Well, what's the impact of your nervous system always being in survival? What's the impact of that on the body, on your mental health from generation to generation as well too?
Yeah, I think that you bring up a great point, be a great segue into the next video, because I think that, the other piece that we want to make sure that we lift up today and every day is how deadly racial trauma is, especially for those, for Black and brown bodies. And it's not just the mental health implications, it's the physiological components too, right? And so understanding the why can't I say that? The cumulative.
Got it.
We're just going to exit out of that one. Impacts of discrimination and racism over time. The impacts that it has on our physiological bodies, and how it does get passed on, generation to generation. So we're going to show this next clip that still goes into what racial trauma, race-based trauma is, and then talking a little bit more about the impacts that it renders. As soon as I get out of this one. There we go.
You can have a job, you can get educated, you can do all of the right things that we're told to do to achieve the American dream. But in this country, as a Black person, none of that will protect you. There's absolutely nothing that can protect me, anyone in my family, anyone that looks like me.
A year ago, we watched George Floyd die on camera. It's by no means the first time we've seen a Black man killed by police in America, but his death was an inflection point. During Derek Chauvin's murder trial, we watched George Floyd's last breaths over and over again. In that same month, Daunte Wright and Ma'Khia Bryant died on camera. It was an exhausting reminder that the outcome of that trial didn't make it any safer to be Black in America. Living with that reality on a daily basis isn't just emotionally exhausting, it's also physically harmful. In this episode, we're gonna tackle racial trauma, what it means, what it does, and how to cope with it as a Black person. I'm Nicole Ellis, and this is The New Normal.
Racialized trauma is a form of stress, and the constant stress that one holds in the body does take a toll.
We live in a society where Black death is common, and you can.
Oh,
It was just working.
I don't think my connection is.
You can trace it back to when lynchings occurred.
Knowing that Black communities have been facing oppression and violence for hundreds of years, and how that's upheld by white supremacist systems, institutions, all of that is not only weary for the soul, but is also really demanding. It demands additional labor.
But how does racial trauma reveal itself in our lives? What does it actually look like?
Racial trauma shows up as anger, anxiety, paranoia, helplessness, hopelessness. The stress hormone is cortisol. Cortisol is related to diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, all diseases that Black and brown bodies are more likely to experience.
Hearing that can be stressful. And so I'm wondering, is it possible to overcome that kind of trauma, or how do you change that for yourself?
So the first thing that Black people can do is to create boundaries about what they watch on an ongoing daily basis.
In a time when a person is feeling exhausted and traumatized, I invite us to give ourselves permission to turn it off.
5-7-9, inhale for 5 seconds, hold for 7 seconds, and exhale for 9 seconds. Over time, it helps to decrease the amount of cortisol in the body.
One way that we can tend to ourselves is actually paying attention to our senses. Sometimes when we're just needing to soothe, rubbing our hands together, rocking, swaying, having a fleecy blanket. And my favorite way is actually cuddling a furry animal, which, gives me the touch and then also some of the smell too. Our people have always known how to take care of one another. Our people have always known how to heal. How did our people or your people connect with the land and find healing in their relationship with land? Maybe through growing food, maybe through spending time near water.
But what if you don't have that kind of context just readily available to you? Like, what if you don't know where your people came from?
Connecting with ancestral wisdom may feel far-fetched, especially for people whose history has been erased. That connection may be someone that we might be related to. It may also be someone in the community that have, been a source of wisdom.
What I do in my research is giving people skills to create Black joy. Maybe for one person, it could be dancing, getting adequate sleep, adequate rest. Joy may also look like taking a long walk with your family.
In situations where the entire country is reeling from watching somebody die on camera, it can be really hard to do that kind of thing without feeling guilty. How do you navigate that?
I know I felt that way. I've gone on vacation and you feel guilty because you feel like you need to do more. But I also think about all of those ancestors I had, or all those people whose shoulders I stand upon who were not able to take a vacation. It's a way of honoring them.
The essence of solidarity is that we are able to co-lean on one another. When my community is hurting, I can lean on yours. When your community is hurting, please lean on mine. And so that offers us an opportunity to rest.
Does it eliminate the threat? No. But what it does, it gives us a tool to counter the ongoing trauma that we may have in our lives.
We're going to continue to cover topics like this, so stay tuned. For more stories like this one, find us on thelily.com and washingtonpost.com.
Bend my elbow.
There's so much in this short video. I almost don't know where to start, right? So I'll just start everywhere and anywhere. I think about just right out of the gate, the comment that was made that essentially as a Black person in America, that American dream, right? That idea of if you just work hard enough, if you do all the right things, you will reap the benefits. And the speaker basically saying that as if you're Black in America, there's absolutely nothing, right? That what I got was like, that will guarantee that you will be alive and stay alive, let alone achieve that so-called American dream. And so I think about those components, right? Again, going back to like the definition of trauma, how we view what traumatic events are and what trauma is. And then I go back to the experiences, especially of Black people, not being foreign to witnessing the brutality and the violence that is being placed upon Black people, right? Because it has been normalized for so long. So whether it's the lynchings, I think about those images where there are Black bodies, but humans who are hanging from a tree, and in a sea of white people, where it's a show, right?
And children are even present.
Children, the racial terror, the racial terrorism that was experienced then. And then, how, again, the evolution of that has been through forms of police brutality. And those are the big pieces, right? Where I'm seeing someone who looks like my brother. I'm seeing someone who looks like my family members, myself being targets of hate crime, doing, again, I think of Philando Castile, right? Doing everything the right way and still being murdered. And so, I think and recall moments of, I love taking, I would rather do a car trip than fly. I have an irrational fear of flying. And yet I remember having, depending on where I was supposed to go for work, being able to drive there was no longer a luxury for me, because I was witnessing so many people that look like me being killed, followed with no consequence. I then developed a pretty big fear of being one of those people that get stopped, right? And so I think, anyway, I would love to get your impressions of any part of that. But I think I want to highlight the fact that there are things that happen day in and day out that we witness that are happening to people who look like us. And I may not have experienced that myself. And yet I hold a pretty healthy level of fear and concern that it will happen to me. So that impacts my level of anxiety, experiencing depression. It elevates my blood pressure. It prevents me from engaging in meaningful ways. There is a healthy level of fear and hypervigilance that I experience. So anyway, yeah.
I can't help but think that, like, when you were talking about the way in which Black and Brown people have been treated, how that's normalized, I often see, like, there's like two sides of the spectrum, right? You have the hypervigilance, all the experiences that Black and Brown people hold, right? And have this hypervigilance over here and this fear, this trauma here. And then you have the desensitization of white folks on the opposite side. And so that's the disconnect, is like the disassociation. I 100% believe racism is a disassociation to emotions and empathy and understanding. And so that's why, so when Black folks are in conversations, whether you're on an academia level or you're on whatever other level, when you're in conversations with white people about the impacts of racism, whether it's sharing your story of how it's impacting you, oftentimes Black folks experience even just the irritation, the frustration, and are triggered in their body in those conversations, because the reality is that there's a disassociation. What we're working with is like the desensitizing of a culture and a community and a country that normalized violence across the board, not just with Black folks, but we're talking about First Nations, Indigenous folks, right? There's such a normalization. And so what is happening to your mental health and to your inner being when you disassociate yourself to the harm and the violence that's being created on a group of people, right? Based off of race, based off of sexuality, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I think that's what I thought about. And I also thought, I can't help but think, someone said in the chat, I'm looking at the chat, so many great points in the chats. Rest is probably my ancestors' wildest dreams. That part, my favorite part is point 4 in that video when they were talking about land, ancestry, the disconnection to heritage and lineage, which will lead us into our next video. But I think that that's one of the biggest things, is that when there is communities and groups of people that do feel disconnected and don't even know how to heal from the racial trauma they've experienced. And so, but there are ways to do that. And part of that healing is that part of like doing something that my ancestors were never given the privilege to be able to do, which is rest. Because we know
Right.
Black folks worked, and they worked hard, despite the narrative that Black people are lazy, right? And
Sure.
so yeah, we can lead into the next video if you want.
Yeah, and I think that that's the big piece, right? The part at the very end. I appreciate the 5 steps that they shared, which made me think of our ongoing conversation about essentially resiliency versus liberation.
Right.
I think developing the tools and the skills that we need to become more resilient is necessary, because we operate in a system that has yet to understand that it is a faulty system. And even if, as I say that, I'm going to correct myself. The system is not faulty because the system was created the way that it was intended to operate. So the resiliency really comes into place for those of us to figure out how to continue to be able to move forward and wake up in the morning and go to our jobs and care for our families, do all those things. I'm a firm believer that we have to enhance our capacity to be resilient. I also see that as being a temporary Band-Aid, and they're great coping skills for a short period of time, right? And so those steps that they give us, I'm a big fan of breathing. I didn't even realize how much taking a deep breath can help regulate my body. So I think those are all helpful. I had a picture in my mind of basically, like, if I were to go swimming every day in a pool that was toxic, and I started feeling, ill, and then I started building my resiliency by maybe putting on a different suit that covers my entire body and my face, right? These are the resiliency tools, but I'm still going back into the same toxic system. So when I think of liberation, I think about freedom. I think about the pool being clean, that I don't have to worry about expanding my capacity to be resilient. So I'll just leave it at that and go into this next video.
All the things.
All the things.
All the things.
My name is Shawna Murray-Browne. I am a native Baltimorean. I'm an integrative psychotherapist and a liberation-focused community healer. My work is to help Black folk and those that care for them remember how to heal themselves. I work from the premise that Black folks especially, and though Indigenous folks and other folks of color come from a lineage history of having natural ways of caring for, of nurturing, and of healing. Systems or isms like racism and capitalism have made money off of our ongoing oppression and us not knowing that we have these innate powers. I could say individually, our reaction to and the generational harms that have been passed on and has transformed into a culture, not even having the ability to ask the right questions to know how to gain access to this information. The way that we've been trained is so Eurocentric and is grounded in Eurocentric values. It makes sense that even the practitioners would feel like, if I could fix the thing, then it would be better. In the beginning, I was just using the usual evidence-based practice models, but I felt that it was consistently missing the mark based off of what I was hearing from folks within the community. The turning point for me would be when my brother was murdered. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia while he was incarcerated. I had dreams about my brother being murdered before he actually was, and I thought that it was residue. from seeing so many hashtags of Black men and women and children being killed. And so the first part of that is that there's seldom space in mental health care in the way that we are addressing these traumatic experiences to contend with the multiplicity of experience. After I returned to work after grieving my brother, and what I felt as a professional was that I had to make a decision of my profession or my personal life and family and lived experience, or how I was going to advocate against the system on behalf of my brother. So I had this really challenging experience of feeling that the mental health system was not created for Black folks that were actually enduring systems of oppression, because it didn't allow me to show up as my full self, and it required that I dehumanize myself to treat myself as an object in order to hold space for the folks that I was serving. But I did decide that I would be out of alignment, out of right relationship, if I did not use my voice to talk about the harm and the systemic harms done to my brother. And so that early stage experience of having to make that decision and making it out of fear, while being surrounded by professionals who did not know how to engage with me, their colleague, their therapist, they are the instructors. That's when I started to shift and decide that I was not going to be silent about how the culture of mental health care permeated and upheld systems of racism and white supremacy by virtue of the way that we're trained. How do we ensure that what's happening in the therapy space is actually raising critical consciousness? We can advocate, and we can do that in a way that will elicit a level of individual success or individual freedom for the folks that we're holding space for.
I'm being mindful of this time just now. I wasn't mindful of it before. And realizing that we've got 10 minutes. So here's what I want to pose to you, right? I know that you specifically have gone through trainings by Shawna Murray-Browne. And so ultimately, just kind of throwing this your way, like, what is it that we're actually talking about when we talk about liberation-based therapy and or decolonizing therapy?
Yeah, it encompasses this idea from moving from what you said earlier, moving from coping skills, moving from survival skills, which were needed, right? We have to normalize people who have made to be marginalized. Their need for survival and the coping skills and the resiliency was needed in order to survive. But moving from that into more into liberation, right? There is liberation that can happen in many different forms. I am a firm believer that those in my community and within my people know how to liberate us more than anybody else does, right? I don't look to white folks to liberate me as a Black individual. I look to my ancestors and my people and the ways in which that they did things in the past for healing to liberate me. I look to my spirituality and what spirituality looked like within my people for liberation. And then there's the understanding of, okay, we live in a system that continues to perpetuate harm and violence, whether it's covert and it's overt. So then what does that look like when we as individuals who are made to be marginalized are creating ways of liberation, are reconnecting to our ancestors, are doing natural ways of healing, because there is so much there historically and ancestrally that we can tap into and we do tap into. What do we do when we still have to navigate and work within the system that we are living in, right? It's like the pool situation that you were talking about. And so it's our Western way of psychology and mental health is so focused on Western ways. It's very individualistic, right? When we look at the worldview and understanding of different cultures, it's not individualistic. It's not even either or, it's both and, it's collective, it's community, it's both individual and within the collective. And so when we are looking at the ways that Western psychology and mental health have always operated, coping skills and resiliency and the things that are evidence-based are very individualistic interventions. That's why they don't work on Black and brown people as effectively as white folks. So it just doesn't work that way. And so it's moving from that to liberation, which is more of a collective changing the system. So those who are making the changes within, they have a system that actually creates sustainable change, right? Because there's temporary change, but what about the sustainable change, right? Sustainable change is created when the rules, the underlying messages, the narratives, the biases, when those subconscious level things change, that is when sustainable change is a little bit, like it can be more achievable, right? We can see the changes really happen on a very deep level. And so liberation happens two ways. I'm going to reiterate that. Liberations happen within a community that works within their community, that's ancestral, and that's going back, incorporating what the ancestors have done for healing, which decolonizes the way that Western culture identifies healings to be, right? And interventions to be. It's very different, moving away from Western practices and interventions. And then the other area of it is, then what about the systems in which that we still live in that operate and was designed by white people for white people, that do not work for anybody else that's considered the alternative to white standards, if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. I don't know if it makes sense to everyone just quite yet. Yeah, I think the big piece when Shawna was speaking about, again, that this is why I say it's deeply woven into the system. It's not just the practices that are happening right now. It's the fact that the individuals who are in private practice, in organizations delivering mental health care, they were trained through an institution that is using a curriculum that doesn't include everyone. And so I think as practitioners, really being able to simultaneously do our own individual work to figure out how we are perpetuating systems of oppression, and then also as an organization figuring out again, how can we as a program, a practice, figure out how to best serve all people coming in. Yeah, because one size does not fit all. And for those who are who don't fit, who are Black and brown, BIPOC individuals, we recognize rather quickly if someone does not understand our experiences. Yeah. We have 5 more minutes. I know that we were supposed to have a Q&A. I don't think that we're going to get there. And there's so much more that we can unpack here. I think the big thing that I would say that we didn't even get into the meat, and y'all will, right? And so one of the things that we talked about, we want to make sure that our participants are thinking about as they exit our discussion is, don't be afraid to continue doing your own deep dive and doing your own research on this particular topic. And not just about this particular topic, but again, doing your own, deepening your own analysis about how you as a human in this world may not know what you don't know, and start to ask those questions of why things came to be and who it has benefited thus far, as opposed to who it might be impacting, or in addition to who it might be impacting. And then the other piece is there are lots of opportunities for folks to take trainings. And like I said, I don't know if you want to put a little plug into the decolonizing therapy. Right? You did that training.
Yeah. It's a decolonizing. It's decolonizing therapy for Black folks by Shawna Murray-Browne. She has multiple trainings in there, and what's awesome she even decolonizing the way she does training, which is amazing. Because a lot of times what we do is we take trainings, check mark, we did it, we got a certificate, so now we're liberation focused. No, she really invites us to stay within the community, and there's a constant engagement. We do not say we got it, and there's intentional conversations, there's intentional centering, there is embodiment work that is also incorporated within her training. She definitely has set up a system to really challenge us as mental health practitioners on how we can decolonize in the way that we show up, even in the way that we train and learn in these spaces. This is really great.
Yeah. I think the other piece that we'll say before maybe asking everyone to put their cameras back on for like the 1 minute that we'll have left over is, please continue to have conversations with the people in your community, right? Continue to explore this topic with the people that you work with. You don't have to have all the answers before you engage in, I don't ever say difficult conversations, I say pivotal conversations. And so yeah, just continue to have these conversations. And if you identify as being part of the dominant culture, Judith and I really invite you all to have these conversations with other people who are in dominant culture. So we can also make sure that we provide links to the training that was referenced. There are some articles and other things that we can make sure that we pass over to the wonderful people at the dorm to be able to pass out to anyone who might want it. And that's it. And that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Sorry, there wasn't any time left for Q&A.
No, thank you both so much. We'll have to do a repeat so that there's more and more time to really dig into these truly important issues. As you both said at the beginning, we're just gonna scratch the surface, and there's so much work to be done. So thank you. We are very grateful for you both sharing your time and your experience and your knowledge with us. Thank you very much. And thank you also everybody for attending and being a part of this as well. We will keep the conversations flowing. Like I mentioned, there is going to be a part 2 of this series, Racial Trauma and Mental Health Implications. We're going to be focusing on the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. The date of that presentation is to be determined. Also just want to give a reminder that we are going to be having an in-person CE event June 15th in Washington, DC, to talk about experiential techniques and strategies. So lots of exciting topics coming up on the horizon, but Tracy and Judith, thank you. We want to continue the dialogue, and we hope to see everybody here again soon on a Zoom.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.